In this video, we'll take a look at the Hyperloop, the brand new method of transport brought forth by the entrepreneur and billionaire Elon Musk.
But it would be for a fifth mode of transports. I have a name for it, which is called the Hyperloop.
The Hyperloop?
Hyperloop, yeah.
The system is proposed to travel at an average speed of 900 kilometers an hour and at a top speed of 1,220 kilometers an hour.
It's very similar to an airplane on high altitudes. You have a low pressure environment inside the tube, a capsule that doesn't touch anywhere, hovers, and then because of the low pressure doesn't encounter a lot of resistance.
It's also a lot faster. You can basically get from downtown LA to downtown San Francisco in 30 minutes. It's also extremely energy efficient due to solar power utilization. In fact, the Hyperloop could generate more power than it consumes as a closed system.
Because you generate more power than you would consume in the system.
It's also much cheaper to build. It's about 1/10 the cost of the proposed California high-speed railway system. This means that tickets could cost as little as $25.
1,000 kilometers per hour in a vacuum tube for less than the construction costs of what is currently proposed for the high-speed rail connection. It will generate more power than it uses by solar panels, and a ticket will only cost about $20. Yeah, and it's complete bullshit. Now sure, the principle is fine. It's just not viable in practice. You know, it's like the solar roadways thing. It sounds great, but in reality, it's just bullshit made up by snake oil salesmen. Or the mindlessly optimistic daydreaming of those who just don't want that bitter taste of reality. The first real challenge is simply the near impossible goal of building a 600 kilometer long vacuum chamber. I mean, even in the smaller version of the Hyperloop, which I could only just about stand up in, so it's about 2 meters in diameter, which has a cross section of about 3 meters squared, and if it's 600 kilometers long, at 600,000 meters long, that means that the volume will be about 2 million cubic meters. So let's compare that to the world's largest vacuum chamber, shall we? Which is about 1/50th of the volume.
This is NASA's Space Power Facility near Cleveland, Ohio, and it is the world's biggest vacuum chamber. It's used to test spacecraft in the conditions of outer space.
Yeah, that's the vacuum chamber that NASA uses to test their spacecraft in, and it's 50 times smaller than the smaller version of the Hyperloop.
It's used to test spacecraft in the conditions of outer space, and it does that by pumping out the 30 tons of air in this chamber until there are about 2 grams left.
Now, there's a problem with making vacuum chambers that size, and the first is they need to be quite heavy in construction.
Aluminium is not the best thing, the strongest material to build a vacuum chamber out of. So they built an outer concrete skin so that this thing can take the force that's present on the outside when it's pumped out to the conditions of outer space.
Because there's a lot of atmosphere pushing on the outside, about 10 tons per square meter. So to help you visualize it, here I have a square meter. So atmospheric pressure is equal to about 10 meters of water. So that's like 10 times this distance here. So if I were to put 10 meters on top of my 1 square meter, a cubic meter of water weighs about a ton. So 10 cubic meters pushing down on 1 square meter would give you a pressure of 10 tons pushing down on this square meter, because there's a lot of atmosphere pushing on the outside, about 10 tons per square meter, and there is absolutely nothing pushing on the inside because it's a vacuum. And it also has to take the vibrational force of a 15-ton capsule going through it at nearly the speed of sound. So the walls are about 2 centimeters thick, about an inch or so. Cool, so we can now do the calculations for just the steel required to make only the tube in this structure. And it turns out to be about the same mass as the steel in the World Trade Center, which, to be fair, was a ginormous building. Cool, so that would get us the steel to make the tube. Then comes the first real problem, which is expansion. Most people know that if you just have, say, bridges, you need an expansion joint in them. So let's take a look at the expansion for steel. It's about 13 parts per million per degree Celsius. So let's say the temperature range is going to be between freezing point and 40 degrees Celsius. That's basically a hot day, which means the overall length of this tube is going to vary by about 500 parts per million, that sort of thing, which means that the overall length of the Hyperloop from the coldest day to the hottest day will vary by about 300 meters, about the length of 3 football fields. Clearly, expansion joints are necessary. Well, that would be easier if you're looking at the expansion joints on a bridge. Not so much if they're an expansion joint for a vacuum tube, because it's got to hold that vacuum almost perfectly whilst it's changing its length. So let's give them something reasonable like a 100-meter segment of tubing. So the expansion difference between say a hot day and a cold day there would be about 50 millimeters, so a couple of inches. So you would need a joint about every 1/10 of a kilometer, such that in the 600-kilometer Hyperloop, you would need about 6,000 moving part vacuum seals, and a failure on any one of them could be disastrous for the people inside the Hyperloop. And this is of course assuming 100-meter segments of tubing. Their current segments look to be more like 10 meters or so, which would mean they would need 60,000 moving part vacuum seals on a 2-meter diameter tube. I mean, the only thing even remotely comparable in the world is the Large Hadron Collider, which is, I don't know, maybe 50 kilometers or so of tubing, albeit underground, so they're more or less a constant temperature, so they really don't have these expansion problems. And even at that, it's 1/100th of the volume of the Hyperloop, and it doesn't have a 15-ton capsule going through it. And while it does have a large number of seals to it, for the large part, they won't be moving part seals. They'll just be static seals that all you have to do is tighten up the bolts and you're done. So how do they address this in their white paper, which is the go-to documentation for the Hyperloop? A telescopic tube similar to the boxy ones used to access airplanes at airports would be needed at the end station to address the cumulative length change of the tube. Now that just blew my mind, because that really does sound like they just intend to weld all of the tubes together. That is, they haven't done even the simplest expansion calculations. Now sure, welded tubes would be great for holding the vacuum, but it does mean that your station's going to have to move by about 3 football pitches between the hottest and coldest day.
This station is probably the most compact station, and it really, the entire activity actually happens almost here. This is more still of a lounge shopping area.
This is where you get your magazines,
yes,
your coffee.
But still everything happens on the go.
Not to mention how you expect the support pylons to hold all of this up and account for that movement. Plus, if you're just going to weld all of these tubes together, you're going to get massive buckling problems. Painted white or not, in the hard Californian sun, the top of these things will get hotter than the bottom. That is, the top will expand more than the bottom. And with a 500-mile long tube, you're going to get massive buckling problems of the sort that you would get on a bimetallic strip.
The brass should expand more than the steel, so the bimetallic strip should bend toward the steel side.
Beautiful.
Your alternative, which probably has a better chance of working, is the 6,000 vacuum seals, although I've got to be honest, vacuum seals on a 2-meter diameter tube, speaking as someone who has decades of experience working with vacuums, I really don't rate your chances of that either. So why is this thing running under vacuum anyway? Well, that's easy. You cut down on the air resistance, and this is the main reason why airplanes fly so high, is because the atmosphere gets thinner the higher you get. There's less air resistance. However, there is a compromise that your engines need that air to burn the fuel and create thrust. So you can't go too high, otherwise your engines run out of oxygen. However, there's another problem. People also need air to live, so if there's any rupture in the Hyperloop capsule for any reason whatsoever, you will die in the Hyperloop in pretty much exactly the same way that you would die in deep space.
You know, it's at times like this, when I'm stuck in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young.
Why? What did she tell you?
I don't know. I didn't listen.
And of course, people won't be able to hear you call for help because, as Alien informed us, in space, no one can hear you scream. And that's essentially what the Hyperloop is doing. It's bringing all of the impracticalities of space travel down to the surface of the Earth and putting them inside a capsule traveling at about the speed of sound in a giant gun barrel. So another one of the key problems is what happens when something goes wrong. If you're traveling at about 1,000 kilometers per hour, the speed of sound in a capsule within centimeters, an inch or so of a tube, the velocity of the capsule is about that of a bullet fired from a gun, except it's a 15-ton bullet. Any failure whatsoever will rip through that 2-centimeter outer tube like candy. Now, sure, anyone in that capsule will die pretty much instantly in the event of a crash, but then again, a car crash at 50 miles an hour will probably do that for you. The problem then comes that a single breach in the Hyperloop will probably kill everyone else in the Hyperloop. You see, once you breach the outside tube, air will rush into the tube at about the speed of sound. Roughly, this is how it works. The speed of sound is mostly determined by how quickly air molecules can actually knock into each other, which is basically how quickly the molecules are going. When they're moving into a vacuum, of course, there's nothing to stop them. So the air rushes into the vacuum basically at the speed of sound. And yeah, that will destroy any capsule it hits and probably cause a cascade failure. I mean, ballpark numbers. There's a vacuum inside the tube, so the gas rushing into it is a pressure differential of 1 atmosphere. So what's it like getting hit by a pressure differential of 1 atmosphere? Well, let's take a look at it this way. Atmospheric pressure is about 10 tons per meter squared, about the size of a reasonable truck. And that 1 atmosphere pressure wave coming down the tube towards you is coming towards you at about the speed of sound. The only redeeming feature here is that air, gas, is pretty compressible stuff, but you can still expect it to kill pretty much anything it hits. I mean, you get a rough idea of what a 1 atmosphere pressure wave will do from some nuke benchmarking tests.
Blasts from airbursts where overpressure exceeds 10 psi can cause substantial damage to destroyer-type ships. Above 14 psi, it could even result in hull rupture, flooding, and sinking. The shock imparted by blast to the superstructure can damage or carry away equipment. At greater distances, overpressure above 6 psi can distort, rupture, and carry away light structures and equipment. Interior equipment and compartments may be damaged by the blast, collapsing deck structures or bulkheads. Overpressure entering through openings can damage boilers. Blast injuries to exposed personnel, represented by this dummy, is usually severe over 3 psi. Here it was 6 psi.
Well, one of the methods by which they're going to power this is by a giant turbine on the front of the capsule, which is great, apart from they're running in a near perfect vacuum, which means that engine will have to spin astronomically fast, faster than it would if it was a terrestrial engine designed to run in our thick atmosphere.
The engine is roaring along at full throttle. The blades spin at almost 3,000 revolutions per minute. The centrifugal force at the tip of each blade is equivalent to the weight of a 110-ton locomotive.
I mean, damn, our plane engines, which are designed to run at about 30,000 feet, about 10 kilometers, run on about 1/5 of an atmosphere of pressure. That's 200 times higher than the pressure in the Hyperloop. Now, in the Hyperloop, of course, you had 200 times less pressure than that, which is great. That means you get 200 times less drag on your capsule. The downside, of course, is that your turbine will produce 200 times less thrust by actually spinning in that atmosphere than if it was a turbine spinning at about the altitude that a cruising jet flies at. Now, there's a problem with big objects spinning that fast. That's that they tend to structurally fail just from the G-forces alone. But even if they don't, objects spinning that fast contain a lot of energy.
Ziggo up to full speed now. It takes 6 seconds, and Ziggo is there and deadly when he is.
Now, that's not a problem as long as your bearings are good and everything is balanced.
So you can see he's not fully balanced. He's coming up.
However, if everything is not balanced, if say for instance there's a pocket of high pressure air because someone shot a few holes in the Hyperloop, then the turbine is all of a sudden going from running at 1,000th of an atmosphere to hitting a pocket of air at 1/10th of an atmosphere. That is going to have 100 times the force acting on it, which is the sort of thing that causes blade failure. So let's imagine a tube failure. Now it's expected that that will also break any power connections that the vehicle has, so it's now only got its batteries. Well, what about the people trapped inside this 600-kilometer long steel tube? Well, there's a wall of air travelling down towards them at about the speed of sound, essentially a shockwave, and it'll kill everyone in the capsule when it hits them. The only option is to put on the brakes, the emergency brakes. Now, of course, you have to hope that the emergency brakes are good enough and the capsule strong enough to survive being hit by that 1 atmosphere pressure wave. And honestly, I've got my doubts about that, because these capsules are designed to run at 1,000th of an atmosphere. I have limited faith of them being structurally strong enough to survive being hit by a 1 atmosphere pressure wave, travelling at about the speed of sound. But let's just say for the sake of argument that you survive. You are now trapped inside a 600-kilometer tube in a sealed capsule, which you cannot get out of. And when the air in that capsule runs out, or more specifically, when the carbon dioxide builds up enough, you're going to die. And how are you going to rescue people inside a 600-kilometer long metal tube? Look, the whole thrust system relies on being able to get decent compression off a gas which is almost at space-type pressures, 1,000th of an atmosphere. I mean, hell, their thrust here is basically provided by a turbomolecular pump, because that's almost the only sort of thing that's going to be able to compress gas that's essentially space. I mean, it's a neat idea, except those things are typically fairly small and run at 20,000 RPM. That's spinning 10 times faster than the turbine blades on a plane.
The engine is roaring along at full throttle. The blades spin at almost 3,000 revolutions per minute.
I mean, the blades here won't just weigh 100 tons per piece.
The centrifugal force at the tip of each blade is equivalent to the weight of a 110-ton locomotive.
It'll be more like 1,000 tons. Yeah, which is probably one of the reasons why you don't find large-scale turbomolecular pumps. And even if you could, it's doubtful if they would fail safe if a loose object just got thrown up from the track or someone just shot some holes in the Hyperloop or something. I mean, the whole thing is just mind-blowingly optimistic. You have capsules here going through the tunnel at basically the speed of sound. If they get hit by any loose object, that's essentially the equivalent of the static capsule being shot with a gun. And what happens in the event of a catastrophic decompression? Oh, they're just going to repressurize the whole tube. Really, it's just that easy. You're going to let 2,000 tons of air into the tube before anyone succumbs to the effect of being subjected to a vacuum that is basically the equivalent of space. And that's to say nothing of the emergency deceleration problems. You know, you're traveling at almost the speed of sound. You repressurize the tube, you'll be likely pulling re-entry type G-forces. So what? There's going to be tens of thousands of large-scale vents along the whole length of the tube for an emergency repressurization. Thousands more things that can go wrong with the system.
The Hyperloop's biggest problem? Making tube travel comfortable.
So this is kind of like the Hyperloop think tank design center right now.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, once it's all repressurized, all of these 15-ton capsules will be able to drive themselves on regular wheels to an emergency exit.
What are these models over here?
So we have 2 sets of models. The first ones here at the back, they were really study models that were investigating. These are more of a finished product that investigate more of the interior situation and also the sitting.
So these are all the options of the capsules.
Well, what does that emergency exit look like? Well, no one really knows, because they've not even mastered the relatively simple stuff, like, say, for instance, constructing a 600-kilometer long vacuum pipeline. I mean, sure, the Hyperloop's a great idea, just as long as you ignore all the practicalities of actually building it. I mean, just look, in the event of a large-scale tube failure, let's just say they have an emergency stop on one of the capsules. They're saying that they're getting a capsule leaving every 2 minutes on a 30-minute trip. So there's going to be about 15 capsules in the whole length of the tube. That's a capsule about every 40 kilometers or so. Now imagine one of these capsules ruptures the outside tube. By the time the shockwave reaches the next capsule, it'll be a column of air of about 40 kilometers in length. It'll be moving at about the speed of sound, and that column of air will weigh about 100 tons. And it's going to be hitting a capsule that weighs 15 tons. I mean, when I did my vacuum breach experiment, my metal ball had a much higher mass than the air entering the tube. This is going to be our mini 100th scale Hyperloop, and there's a little metal ball in there. So we actually zoom in on the little metal ball. Okay, so there's a little metal ball in my mini Hyperloop. So this is what it looks like filmed at 1000 frames per second, and as you can see, there's really quite a formidable acceleration there. And bear in mind, this is a tiny diameter tube over a short distance, about half a meter. The air had about 1/100th of the mass of the ball it was pushing, and this was the effect. I mean, what you would be likely getting in the actual Hyperloop is something more along the lines of the Mythbusters experiment, where the air filling the vacuum tube had a mass much larger than the object it was pushing, a ping pong ball in this case.
So now we're pumping it down. 3, 2, 1.
Whoa! But more importantly, let's take a peek at the can. This wonderful hole is now, so this hit it with 500 miles an hour coming out of this.
And yet they managed to fire that ping pong ball at almost the speed of sound, which is more or less what you would expect to happen to these capsules in the event of a large-scale tube failure. You see, with planes, you can make many of the same arguments. However, if the plane's hull is breached, first of all, you're only at 0.2 of an atmosphere, and on top of that, there is an emergency air supply which will allow the pilot to fly down to more breathable altitudes. Well, if an engine fails, he still has others to fly at, and if there is vibrations or turbulence of some sort, it's not a big deal, because there's a lot of space to fly into. It's not like if he goes off course by a couple of centimeters or an inch or something that it will destroy the plane and kill everyone on it, and destroy every other plane flying that route. You see, planes over the years have been designed such that a single point failure is not catastrophic. Planes, of course, cost a lot of money, but they're fairly easy defensible vehicles. Now, when they're near to the ground, of course, they can be shot at. But once in the air, they very quickly go beyond the range of all but the high-end military weapons. That's something that's simply not the case with the Hyperloop. It's 600 kilometers long, and it runs down the middle of a freeway. It's indefensible. Any crazy with an anti-material rifle could shoot holes in the tube, something which would probably be fatal to almost the whole system. But maybe most importantly, one plane crash does not destroy the entire infrastructure and kill everyone else flying the same route. Look, the whole deal with a Hyperloop is it's only really efficient over shorter distances.
Just as a side note, for distances longer than that, it's actually more economically viable to use a supersonic jet.
That is where you can get on and off it quickly. You know, so it's one of those things, you don't have all of that long security at airports. But once you get beyond about 500 kilometers, it becomes much more efficient to fly because planes don't require $10 million per mile tube to run it. However, in reality, the destruction of a single 15-ton capsule traveling at about 1,000 kilometers per hour in the tube would rupture the tube and likely be fatal to everyone else in the Hyperloop. Practically, what this means is you'll probably need as much security for Hyperloop travel as you would for air travel.
It's also a lot faster. You can basically get from downtown LA to downtown San Francisco in 30 minutes.
Which in reality means there will probably be no more time advantages for using the Hyperloop over flying. Add to this that most folks seem to have forgotten a zero off the end of their budget. You know, they're estimating it's going to cost, I don't know, $6 billion or something.
It's also much cheaper to build. It's about 1/10 the cost of the proposed California high-speed railway system.
Berkeley guy reckons 100 billion, which is comparable to the cost of a maglev railway of comparable length that they are currently building in Japan. Which, sure, it only goes about half the speed of the Hyperloop, but then again, it doesn't have all the disadvantages of space travel in a gun barrel. And their reckoning of recovering the Hyperloop infrastructure cost in about 20 years assumed there were no running costs, no maintenance, no infrastructure, inspection, repair, or energy costs. So let's just maybe be a little more realistic here and say that their $25 ticket becomes something a little more plausible, like $250. And their 30-minute journey time, what with getting to the actual station and getting through security, becomes something more sensible, like, I don't know, 1.5 hours. In reality, it's probably going to cost about as much as a plane ticket. It's going to take about as long as a plane journey.
Do you feel like you're working on a project that's really going to change the future?
Oh, absolutely. If I have a date and I want to see the opera in San Francisco, I can literally do that and be back in time to go to sleep at my own house.
Plus the added advantage of enjoying all the dangers of space travel in the Californian desert. So yeah, the hype of the Hyperloop, of which there is plenty, even if you ignore all the scandalous stuff about tripling the pay of a PR executive to almost $500,000 per year while dating her, then firing her when the engagement was broken off. Yeah, I mean, if you ignore all of that, yeah, $500,000 salary, PR executives. No wonder they built an entire stage and got wall-to-wall publicity.
We are standing on hollow ground. This is a significant moment for us.
For what was in reality just a maglev train traveling a couple of 100 meters.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Seriously, dudes, your countdown was longer than your maglev train journey.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
When you think of Hyperloop, you think maybe this is going to happen years from now. It's going to happen much quicker than anyone imagines.
Wow, a maglev train. That constitutes the first successful test of the Hyperloop.
It's also extremely energy efficient due to solar power utilization. In fact, the Hyperloop could generate more power than it consumes as a closed system.
Because you generate more power than you would consume in the system.
Oh, by the way, folks, any transport system would become energy self-sufficient if you put solar panels over the top of it. You don't need your railway to run in a vacuum tube to make that happen.